Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us here at whatever time it is, wherever you may be. Really appreciate you joining myself and Gary Bolles to talk about his piece from March on the Great Reset, on the impacts of COVID and how that's going to affect the economy, and in particular unemployment. You may know Gary from many, many things over the years. More recently, and in context for this call, he is serving as the chair of the future of work at Singularity University. Welcome, Gary. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's great to see you, Chris.
Likewise, likewise. I can't wait to see you in some networking session at a conference somewhere in a hotel in San Francisco or San Jose sometime in 2021. So
Yeah, some distant future.
Yes, yes. So, hey, I've been very fortunate to know Gary for a number of years now and to benefit from his insights and his great network. And in this particular area, he's done a lot of work over the years with Techonomy and what they're doing over there. And this piece in particular really stood out relative to our question of the month and how we're looking at the future and what we expect to come. So, Gary, you had expected 3 phases really of this great reset in terms of unemployment and the broader impacts that would have on people in the economy. Phase 1 was a ballooning unemployment and went from March, I believe, what was it in March? It was like 5%, 4.4, and right up to 14.7% in April. So you kind of knew that was coming. That was very easy to see. What else did you see coming ahead that actually came to be? What were the things that you predicted that you hit right?
So, it's ironic with a title like Chair for the Future of Work. I don't think of myself as a futurist at all. Instead, what I try to do is sort of see some of the influences, some of the red threads, and how those might map out in different scenarios, and then just try to draw the lines so that people can make their own conclusions. So I wasn't by any means trying to say, here's the dates where certain things will happen by or anything. But instead, what I was trying to say is, well, so if we look back, Great Recession, previous recessions, they all tend to have sort of 3 phases. There's a falling off the cliff phase, and that's where there's increasing uncertainty, there's dampening of economic activity, but it's very lumpy. There are some industries and arenas highly affected, others that aren't. Second characteristic is then there's a lump, sort of riffling along the bottom phase. The markets sort of break apart, they unbundle, they recalibrate, new values created, and then eventually, you're starting to sort of put the pieces back together. But again, it's very lumpy, and there's some places that immediately bounce back, and others that still, 12 years after the beginning of the Great Recession, have not yet fully recovered. And then there's this third phase where you have the potential to build new, or hopefully build better. And so what I said was, employment, which is sort of a mythical construct in our Western economies, but employment, you had some predictable characteristics, and you knew it was very, very likely if we didn't, in the same way we're talking about trying to flatten the curve of the coronavirus, if you didn't flatten the slump of unemployment, what was going to happen is you would hit a point where a huge number of people would be unemployed. Eventually, things would start to get put back together, but you were going to see this big, big gap between the people that make the least, but also have to be in person doing things, and those that are more digital, make more money. And what will happen is the digital make more money crowd is going to get back online and working and being fine, and those that make less or more disadvantaged will be at an even greater disadvantage. And if we don't flatten that slump, what did we do? I wrote the piece in March, published early April, late April. There's a big stimulus in the U.S. And in other countries as well. Although the dynamic in other countries, depending upon the country, was to some extent very different. We could talk about those heuristics, but essentially what we did was we did through a bunch of stimulus, and there's no question that flattened the slump. And then we stopped. That ran out. And so now what we've got is essentially 2 completely different work markets. We've got a work market where there's lots of people that are doing pretty well, and there's a whole bunch of people that are not going to do well for quite some time unless we monkey with our economy again.
Yeah, and so there's a bunch of things I want to unpack in that. But first of all, let me hit the idea of actually having a really anywhere close to accurate picture of the number of people truly unemployed. It's
Yes.
just we've always known that was not possible because of the different ways the Labor Department kind of manages that. Have you seen any reports of what the real unemployment situation looks like, or are people pretty much just going with the Bureau
Yeah.
of Labor Statistics groups?
So in the same way that GDP is a gross domestic product is a horrible way to calibrate an economy, unemployment is a horrible way to try to understand the health of a work market because there's so many fractures in the way that the Bureau of Labor Statistics gathers information, even tries to understand the information, and it leaves out underemployment, which is you could do a lot better.
Yep.
But and it also, and by the way, it also leaves out people who are discouraged from looking. They're not even counted in the rolls and so on. So it's a completely imperfect mentality. But in addition to that, what is in the same way we don't have a healthcare system, we actually have a sick care system.
Yep.
Our systems don't. There are all these negative externalities. If you're healthy, you still pay a massive amount in health insurance, right? So it's a sick care system. Doesn't kick in until you're actually sick, and then suddenly everybody wants to help you because they can make money. They can't make money when you're well. They're only going to make money for the most part when you're sick. We don't have an employment system. We have an unemployment system. That is, we don't encourage all of the ways to keep people working, and especially to have meaningful, well-paid work. Whereas there's a number of other countries that do. And so those are decisions. Like all of it, none of these are laws of nature. They're laws of humans, and we can make better decisions. But since we don't, and since we use these old rules of work to calibrate things like employment, we keep making we're lying to people. We're telling people the wrong things about health of the work market, and we're actually not focusing on the things that are positive. So, in answer to your short answer to your question is there are a couple of metrics that try to look at overall the health of a society. There's one that was actually kickstarted by the Economist magazine, and that gives some sense of a better holistic view, not just how people are working, but a lot of other economic factors as well, including health. But there's nothing that is designed for the nuances, the range of nuances, especially when you've got so many different contexts for work. You've got so many different ways that people can work. So we need a bigger boat. We need new ways of being able to track that.
And now you got me on like 5 different threads, 3 of which are supposed to come later, but we're going to be
That's all right.
over the place a little bit.
Go where it takes us.
Well, the one that really strikes me here is that we've seen this sort of economic transformation so many times over the years, going from a manufacturing to a service economy in the 70s, as that happened, and then again from the service economy, which is still a predominant part of our society, but to more of an information economy with knowledge workers and what that meant. Yet our systems are still based on the early, oh gosh, I'm not citing my history well, but on the early idea of the 40-hour work week and the stuff the first labor unions fought for, right?
Yeah.
This classification of employment is just itself maybe quaint as we're starting to change our situation more. So do you believe that in this time we might be able to actually modernize our view on what employment means and these concepts of the 40-hour work week? And, is there going to be a new form of labor protections that need to arise? Or how do you see this kind of, need for modernization happening?
So first off, our friend John Hagel, talks a lot about metrics that matter. And so what turns out what happens often is that any economy, any society has a set of power dynamics. There's a system. The system works in a certain set of functions, and there's a bunch of laws, regulations, standards for the ways that markets function. And then when you get big shifts in markets, what ends up happening is there's a new mentality that often develops about the new value that's being created, but you're still stuck in the old data. You're still
Hmm.
stuck in the old paradigms. Now, there are some situations where the market calibrates around the new value that's being created and it continually adapts. So venture capital is a good example. So that's one way that capital, which used to be very, very risk averse and could not incorporate the conception that a dropout from Harvard or Stanford could actually get money to go take this massively risky bet and actually build a company of value, right? We went from
Hmm.
a mentality that said, no, that's not possible, to completely calibrating and I think over calibrating
Yes.
around that model. And so markets can adjust, and then you can come up with new heuristics for how those markets work. The problem is that the power dynamic in any economy is the combination of what it is that the government and the society is trying to encourage and what it is that our peculiar Western form of capitalism is trying to encourage. And you have to think of them as Venn diagrams. Like there's a bunch of overlap, but there's things that a lot of people want to leave free markets to make a whole bunch of decisions
Yep.
on their own. And the challenge is that there are negative consequences in some of those decisions. There are negative externalities, things that you say you're not responsible for. Steve Jobs didn't. I don't have my phone here, but Steve Jobs didn't stand on the dais announcing the iPhone and say, "I'm going to ruin human conversation. I'm going to make it so that social media companies can make a gajillion dollars by continually grabbing your attention and shoving it someplace." He didn't say any of those things, but they all were true. Now, we don't hold Apple's feet to the fire for any of those kinds of things, or any other hardware manufacturer for that matter, but negative externalities happen in markets all the time. The problem with work markets is that, to some extent, because the old rules of work focused on a 40-hour week and a 40-hour day and a 40-hour week, 5 days a week, these types of things, the data that goes back to the 1940s, really, the Bureau of Labor Statistics won't change a lot of that data because it wants to be able to compare apples and apples going back that far. And it only literally is just releasing new guidance on how to think about non-standard work, what I call unbundled work, right? But it doesn't have any conception of what I call a portfolio of work. So we, this again, the power dynamics are anchored in the ways we used to do things. There's a whole bunch of reasons why the existing power dynamic is. A lot of people don't want these systems to be updated because it actually would mean that the table would shift, and especially at the power of labor.
Yeah, well, isn't that, I mean, that's what we're seeing right now as, well, anyways, we're about to see, I hope, with the shift to remote, that the power has shifted to the top talent. And in fact, the top talent has always really kind of held that power because they've been able to dictate the terms under which they go under contract, whether it's under employment or as an independent contractor. So, there's this element that I hope that it's a futile effort for them to continue to fight this transfer of power and instead to seek a balance of power. Is that even possible? I mean, we talk about this with brands too, where the brands were all concerned like, oh, we don't own our brand, the customers do. I've always tried to encourage them, no, you both do, you co-created. If it's not for you, it wouldn't exist. Don't we have that same opportunity here to get into a situation where we can have greater mutual empathy for the human, for the organization, and the organization for the human, to get into a better sort of state of being to accomplish the most optimized positive outcomes that they could possibly render?
Sure, that's the future I'd love to have.
I keep seeing
but,
it. I hope that's what we're working towards. But I'm wondering, what do you think it's going to take to get there, or what's going to prevent it?
So first off, it's really important for each of us to approach this with a clear understanding of the system that we're trying to change. And unfortunately, we don't teach this systems thinking very commonly when kids are growing up. Kids are really good systems thinkers. We just don't teach them the basics so that they can look at something complicated and they can distill it down and get what the power dynamics are, right? And I don't want to keep on rooting it in power dynamics, but since you're asking about trying to balance the table, then what ends up happening is the existing people already have a lot of power and a lot of money. Kind of understandable from a human standpoint. They want to both keep what they have and then they'd like to get more. right? So those are pretty standard human
Yeah.
dynamics. So what we, my company Charette, we produced a conference 5 years ago called Closing the Gap. And our premise was that there's a growing gap between haves and have-nots, especially in the recovery from the Great Recession. Each time we hit these reset buttons, there's a big reset. It does seem that actually you get more and more of this spread. You get more non-standard work, you get lower pay, until work markets overheat, like eventually you get a really, really high level of employment so that employers have to pay more. Every time we hit one of these reset buttons, the same things happen. Is you can pay people less, you can give them non-standard work, there's a lot more supply, that is people that want work. And so you get to be choosy, and you get to keep on up requiring jobs. Oh, only required a high school degree before? Oh no, that's a college degree job now. Yeah, I know you're just moving boxes from one place to another, but that requires a college degree because I can get one. And so that power dynamic is perfectly understandable. So how do you reset these power dynamics? Well, we actually, at Closing the Gap, we had a bunch of really smart people talk about how to do that. We had, by the way, this was in Palm Beach, Florida, a mile from Mar-a-Lago, a month before the election cycle began. So we did not invite our current president, but we had Wilbur Ross, who's now Commerce. We had a Koch brother. We had Tony Blair, used to be Prime Minister of England. We had Robert Reich, used to be the Labor Secretary for the US under Clinton, and we had Tom Friedman. And so, and over again, we had really smart people standing on our stage and saying, this is not sustainable. If you have lots of power and lots of money, you need to change the way that you're approaching this. You're going to do it for one of two reasons. You're going to do it either because it's the right thing, or you're going to do it because this is how the pitchforks come out. And so I would argue, in the past 4 or 5 years, the pitchforks have come out. We've seen a lot of the fractures that enter into society when people know the system's gamed and nobody's really telling them how it works or how you can fix it. And so what happens is there's a ton of experimentation across the entire landscape to try to figure out how to recalibrate it. Unfortunately, because we're not good systems thinkers, and we're certainly not trained to be good systems thinkers, we often focus on the things that bias the system, continue to bias the system against us instead of making it work in our favor.
So that is also getting into this idea that a lot of our decision making is fear-based. And I mean, very early, first time I picked up a Tony Robbins book when I was a kid, like I was 13 or something, whenever that was. The dynamic of we tend to avoid pain more than we pursue pleasure. And that's what we're speaking to. It's that fear of, a French Revolution happening here. And certainly we're seeing some of that income inequality in a lot of other ways, and a lot of other inequalities out there in the world coming to bear on the streets right now. And it seems to be that at least the current party in power is employing a tamper it down sort of tactic. I don't want to get into politics too much, by the way, and we've seen in the past that doesn't necessarily work. So what does work is creating this more opportunities and a more inclusive sort of society. Is there anything that's actually some bit of hope relative to what we're facing right now, relative to what's coming?
Yeah, tons. All right. So first, I want to offer two things so that I hope are helpful to listeners. So the first is, if you think in terms of bad future or good future, or mostly just bad future, like how can I make it slightly less bad? Then what happens is, a lot of the fear-based stories that we tell ourselves inevitably result in polarization. So, and it turns out that social media that we have, the beast that we have created, it thrives on that anger, frustration, polar opposite thinking, them and us dialogue and that sort of thing. It makes a lot more money if we are split. And so the first thing I want to encourage people to do is to think in terms of scenarios. Sure, there's a bad scenario, that there's a dystopian scenario, there's a good scenario, there's a utopian scenario, and then there's often a couple scenarios in between. So first off, think of that range of scenarios and what might make likely the outcomes that would go in any one of those scenarios, right? So I'm not trying to tell people to be overly rational. A lot of this stuff is very emotional, and understandably so, especially when we've been in lockdown for 7 months now, in many economies around the world. But first off, to think in terms of scenarios so that you don't feel like there is only bad or worse that could happen, because the truth is there are always opportunities, there are always scenarios that you can design for. And if you don't design for those scenarios that you think are going to come out the way you want them to, then I'll pretty much guarantee the bad ones will. The second is a mentality that my father used to suggest. And so he was is an author of, job hunting books and stuff like that, but he also was a counselor. And he had a woman who came to him one time, and she said she had MS, multiple sclerosis. And he said, well, what is that? And she said, I don't know. I said, well, I don't know what it is either. And this is years ago, 1960s. But he said, what percentage of control do you believe you have over this? And she said, I think it's zero. I mean, they've told me I'm going to be a cripple. She said, well, but you've got to have some percentage control. There's got to be things you can do, action you can take. And if it's 1%, 3%, 7%, let's focus on the strategies for you to take advantage of what you feel you have power for. And so that's the second mentality I would urge people to think of is back in the early 2000s in San Francisco, there was a group of us that we called ourselves the Capital Catalysts. And we said, we want to accelerate the flow of capital to good. How do we do that? And we talked a bunch of it. We talked to a lot of people. And eventually we said, well, you know what? There's a whole bunch of people that want there to be a better world. And especially for business to think about there being a better world. And especially for money that supports business to think about being a better world. If we just make philanthropy and donations and nonprofits better, that's awesome. But it turns out that's in most countries a maximum of 2 to 3% of GDP. Where's the rest of it? Oh, that's over here in business. And so if we could help people to start startups that had more purpose, if we could help capital to want to invest in companies that had more purpose, if we could help businesses that exist already to think about a range of stakeholders, not just their shareholders, but the range of stakeholders, employees, customers, the communities they work in, the planet, and so on. And you could expand the aperture so that those all mattered to organizations, you could move the needle. So we started something called SOCAP in 2008. And I believe all the basic premises that we had, I've actually written about this, we can post some links for your viewers, but basically I believe all of the design heuristics of building that better economy, not only all still exist, but many people are executing on them without any of my involvement or our involvement independently. So those are the things that are good to look at is in these big shifts, there are opportunities to envision that future scenario that you want and then get a whole bunch more people on board to be able to try to create that better future. And so that's the opportunity. The risk is as you unbundle a lot of this stuff, there's a whole bunch of people, again, that lose their whatever advantage they might have had in the past. They get paid less, they have less access to work, they have less access to education. We must now design for that inclusivity going forward, or else in a year from now, the conversation you and I are going to have is how bifurcated our economy has become even more.
Yeah, and so that's actually obviously one of our key hopes in the ability to train people to give them the skills they need to thrive in this new economy that we have. And it's, how do we make it more inclusive? And when we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, you had mentioned that, it all starts with more inclusive organizations. And so we're seeing the call to that now. And obviously with the increasing activation of Black Lives Matter and other awareness around these inequalities that have existed for a while, we're starting to see the beginnings of, I don't know how to refer to it yet, but it's more than just CSR in the sense that it was done for the PR that a lot of it was done for. But are you seeing a greater movement at the tactical level of how, well, I'm not even sure how to word this question. So let me restate this again. Are you seeing any shifts in the real measures of inclusivity? I mean, I know a lot of people are saying, well, we need more women on boards, we need more people of color on boards and things like that. That's true, and that's great. But I still see it as more of a like frontline hiring sort of situation. And I believe it was John O'Dwyn who I was talking to when we were talking about inclusivity, where he said one of the questions he asked CEOs is, how many people in a wheelchair have you hired this quarter, right?
Yeah.
So is there any other measures that show an indication that we are actually moving to more inclusive organizations and starting to see this diminish?
So first off, let me just review the alphabet soup that confronts us in this arena, and then let me talk about the strategies.
Please.
So the alphabet soup that confronts us is CSR, so corporate social responsibility, which is ostensibly what responsibility do you as an organization have to the range of stakeholders that are possible. There's DE&I, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is supposed to be a set of processes that you now can infuse into the way your organization hires and develops workers, so that you will hopefully be more inclusive and invite more people to the dance. And then there's ESG. So there's the whole perception that we have to change the way that we manage ourselves, the way we govern the organization, and so on. The problem with all those, oh, and you mentioned PR, which is all those things done just so that you can get the CEO's name in the press, with hopefully with the CEO smiling. So all of those things can be done authentically and normally are not. So the metrics that you and John are talking about are all critical. We'll go back to what metrics that matter, but authenticity, if you think about authenticity at the individual level, it's a Venn diagram. It's here's the way I think of myself. Here's the way I present myself to the world. And how much of an overlap is there really in those things? Like how do you authentically present yourself to the world? What's the same thing for organizations and for brands? Is if that CEO, that's a great question to ask a CEO. The next question I want to ask the CEO is, how have you completely rethought the purpose of the organization? Because if the purpose of the organization is orthogonal to all of these things that you're talking about in terms of inclusivity. So if you're, basically an organization that is making a whole lot of money advising high net worth individuals, you've got a real hard time convincing me that you can come up with an authentic way that you are going to be able to make an inclusive organization, because your product, your service has nothing to do with inclusivity. It's making people that already have money more money. That's not evil. It's just, it's orthogonal to wanting to be inclusive. And so my push to the CEO and anybody else inside the organization, because this is a group sport. This is a team sport. This is not just, the CEO bringing down some tablets of the new purpose of the organization from on high. This is an authentic set of processes that organizations need to embrace throughout the organization. I call them fractal and flowing. That is, it's got to be where they are practiced throughout the organization. And there's a flow of the practice that is the C-suite is encouraging by their behavior authentically, and the organization is also performing and encouraging and influencing the C-suite's behaviors. So it flows throughout the organization and is highly aligned. So these things are all possible. What is different in this era is leadership. The leadership has always tried to some extent to be, well, leadership will first say it needs to be competent, right? So I say there are 3 C's. Leadership needs to be competent. And if you're not a competent leader, normally that means, by your shareholders' measures, you're going to get kicked out anyway. In this era, now that we're looking literally into each other's homes, I hope we're also learning that the second C is compassion. That is the human side. We have managed workers in organizations, whether they're in the mothership or remote. We've managed them like icebergs. There's the tip of the iceberg that we see, the skills that we know about, the part of themselves that they bring to work, and we have deliberately ignored what's below the waterline. We don't want to know about their extra skills and experience. We don't want to know about their kids and the fact that they've got to go take their grandmother to the doctor today. We don't want to know any of those things. I just want to know, what are the specific skills you are solving the problems I'm paying you for right now? Well, hopefully in this era now, we've learned compassion. We've learned there is a whole human that is showing up for work, maybe not coming to the office because we can't, but, and then the third though is courage. Courageous leadership says, wait a minute, this reset is not just we had to stop and have people stay at home. This reset is where we completely rethink how we channel human energy to create value for our stakeholders. Because that's all that work is. Work is mechanically, it's solving problems, but spiritually, it's channeling human energy. An authentic leader is going to say, I now have the license to be able to make some of these really big wholesale changes throughout the organization. And it starts with whatever I have the power domain for. And I can actually rethink purpose. I can actually change practices so that it isn't a metric that I report just because I've got, oh, hey, I hired 3 people with wheelchairs last month. I want go find me an article I can be on the, the cover of. No, it's how is your organization authentically performing these practices without even thinking? How do managers define work roles, define the problems to be solved, and then guarantee that they will get the best possible and most inclusive process for getting the right person to be able to solve those problems? That's a massive opportunity, but you must treat this as a reset to authentically make those changes and have the courage to do them.
So I know McKinsey has embraced the language of the Great Reset. I get it in my email inbox a few times a week in doing that stuff. But I'm curious, because all this makes sense to me, and I've actually realized in the past couple of months, one of my superpowers is knowing truth when I hear it, and everything you just said is absolutely true. And then it runs into the challenge of the individual human and their own level of personal development, self-awareness, and the rest of it, which is where I've been trying to spend years working on comprehension issues and realizing just literally in the past couple of weeks as we're building our classes that it starts with actually skills-based environmental situation challenges where they can have the opportunity to learn about vulnerability or real authenticity and what this means. But I come back to looking again at this transition and this opportunity here, and the problem is still the quarter over quarter increasing revenue and profit performance that drives the CEO to serve the shareholders and not really consider all the stakeholders. And we've long thought that what we need is something like what Eric Ries is doing with the long-term stock exchange. But is there any companies right now who are publicly traded, who you've seen, who are pushing into this reset to take this opportunity yet, or even in some small ways?
So first off, I don't, as a fan of the trying to understand the anthropology of human change, I don't want to wait too much on this era and instead say, there's the risk of over-indexing on this period and saying, hey, let's take advantage of it. So to some extent, I'm countering what I just said. But the thing I want to make sure we're not doing is we're not saying there's a window, and if we don't take advantage of this window, then it won't happen, right? What I want to instead say is take advantage of the window, but treat it as the beginning. Think of it as the start date for these initiatives, not a window that will close, right? Because what'll end up happening is we'll rebuild our economies. We will eventually thrive again, and then there'll be the next slump, right? So, but during that next period, then we humans, we have pretty significant amnesia, and we forget what it was like when it was hard to find people to do the work. We forget what it was like when our shareholders backed off and said, I get it, you're not going to make your numbers this quarter, that's okay. We forget what that was like, and then the bungee cord of human behavior, we sort of get sucked, pulled right back in, doing the processes that we did in the past. And some things stick, but I don't want people to think, yep, missed our window. So I'll give you an example from before the Great Reset. So I was actually speaking to Tom Friedman. Tom had invited me to a lecture he was giving at our friend Dov Seidman's office, and Dov's a big guy on purpose, and I just happened to fall into a conversation with Mark Bertolini, who at the time was the CEO of Aetna, and he had a big smile on his face. And I said, why are you so happy? He said, well, I had a great lunch yesterday. One of my top shareholders was thanking me for letting him invest in the company. I said, what does that mean? He said, well, year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I announced at the shareholder meeting that I was going to do an initiative focused around mindfulness, health, and basically we're going to, we call ourselves a health company. We want to become a healthy company. We're going to encourage all these healthy practices, train managers around mindfulness, encourage people within the organization to focus on wellness and that sort of thing. And here's what I think it's going to cost. And then after the weekly, or after the call a couple of years before, his top shareholder at the time said, told me, what if I told you I didn't want you to do this? And Mark used a very colorful phrase, but basically, said, go pound sand. And so that shareholder did divest. And then another shareholder, the hedge fund, came in and bought a lot of stock. And the company's stock increased dramatically. And then I found out a couple of weeks later that Mark sold the company. So that's just one example where I would say a courageous leader had a vision for the way that the organization need to function more authentically and inclusively, saw a pathway and a language to be able to try to shift the culture of the organization so that behavior would be different. Now that sounds like, oh, well, it's the CEO's job then. No, it's not the CEO's job. You can do this, and I've got plenty of examples of organizations where somebody in a relatively small corner of the organization, by acting authentically and encouraging others around them to do the same thing, it had ripple effects throughout the entire organization. And I'm happy to give you examples, but basically, the premise should not be, oh, well, I'm not part of the C-suite, I can't affect this change. That's absolutely not true. It's actually the opposite. A lot of this kind of change actually does come from the grassroots inside organizations.
Yeah, and so this is about the distribution of some decision-making authority for individuals to be able to do what's right for the customers. I mean, there's customer call centers where I experience interactions with agents who are very much oriented around that, and they solve things that like you don't think anyone can do. And then of course you run into the others, which is just the script and I can't do anything and I can't help you. And I remember back, actually, I don't know if you knew David Sherbuck or not, but back when he was working with IBM, one of the first famous Twitter customer service incidents was when Rick Clow was heading off to a conference and his Lenovo laptop broke, and Sherbuck saw it and ended up FedExing him one for the next day because he realized Rick was an important person at the time. He was doing feed burner, right, one of the early RSS things. And so, we do see that all over the place. And it is the courage, and there's not enough people who have it. And I'm going to come back to the power situation, because the power of whether or not somebody is able to continue to pay for their mortgage, send their kids to school, all the other stuff is the main power that organizations have held over individuals and lauded over them for some time, which is why they like it the way it is. And in fact, I actually spoke to a friend of mine whose CEO is having a really hard time with no one being in the office because he can't impose his will by walking around and looking at things and leaning over and go, I think it would be better this way, right?
So I call that management by surveillance.
Yes.
So we have a temporary death of management by surveillance, although there's lots of innovators that are trying to offer tools to plug into the Zoom call so you can track people's eye movement and stuff. But for the most part, we've done a reset on management by surveillance for at least a period of time, and I hope that is one of the practices. We can actually see this as forced trust, and we can move to a model that is unenforced trust. We don't need to enforce it. You actually can trust a lot of workers to do what needs to be done.
Yeah, and that's at the heart of it, I think. In that, look, I've had people who have remote work and they go, I just know they're sitting around all day watching Netflix. And I'm like, well, then they're probably not really engaged on your team, are they? They're a paycheck collector, right? Oh, yeah. There's a bunch of paycheck collectors. Well, we need to create more, engaged employees. So I guess the point is that as we start looking at the systems, the complexities of this continue to spread out. Is there a single sort of place where an organization might be able to start enabling this sense of greater trust that would, look, we all know that you have to give trust to earn trust. And anyways, that's a lot of dynamic on that stuff.
Yeah.
But is there a place that an organizational leader should look for where we can start implementing this sort of authenticity in order to build trust?
So I'm going to give you two places that that I know can move the needle. The first is the definition of work roles. So what you just pointed out is, and this is pre-COVID, Gallup does an employee engagement survey in the U.S. every year, and estimates that maximum 1 in 5 employees is engaged in their work. That's stunning. And they actually said about 15% are actively, on the other end of the spectrum, are actively working against their employer, which is even more stunning, like sabotaging the company that they, or the organization they work for. So first off, this was already a problem, like a big problem, right? So Netflix has nothing to do with it. So first off, it's around role definitions. So it turns out that in many cases, humans are actually really good problem solvers if you give them the best problems to solve. And if you give them really boring problems to solve that are repetitive over and over again, it's perfectly understandable that they're not only not going to be engaged, but you're going to look for ways to automate that, right? Because those are the tasks that are most easily automated. Yep. And so it's the fault of leadership. It's the fault of managers. So first off, redefine roles so that they give people interesting work to do, interesting problems to solve, and that changes. And if you need to make that a portfolio of work across the company where it's a set of projects working with, cross function and so on, you're going to find much, much better results. They're going to be a lot more engaged. And especially if it's much more of a project centricity, depending upon the kind of work. The second thing, though, is this mythical role that we have created called the manager. The manager, there is a literally uncountable number of books on management that come out every year. Why is that? Couldn't we have solved this like a long time ago? Well, it turns out it's hard. Why is it hard? Oh, it's hard because we're using an industrial era model. And in case you didn't look around, not many of us work in a factory anymore. And many that do are tending robots. They're not tending the machines the way that people used to. So we've got these industrial era processes, which basically said you need hierarchy, you need structure. A manager has a bunch of direct reports that they control. You manage them by surveillance because you can't trust them. If they walk out of your view, you don't know what they're doing. And by the way, there's a set of rules they have to follow. And if they follow the rules reasonably well, you'll give them a good review or rating. And if they don't, or you don't perceive them to have followed the rules the way you wanted to, you're going to ding them. So what they learn is, if I follow the rules, does this sound like school to you? If I follow the rules and I keep on doing what I need to, then I get to keep on doing it next year, right? And so redefine the manager's role. The example that I use, believe it or not, is from Esther Wojcicki's book, Moonshots in Education. So she's talking about changing the role of the teacher from the sage on the stage, one person, many listeners, to the guide on the side. You go from the one with all the answers to the one with the right questions. That is the new role of the manager. That is how you will get systemic change throughout the organization. You want an example of a company that's trying to do that at scale? Look at Novartis, 100,000 employees, and they have a process called unbossing. And there's a whole set of cultural anchors around unbossing that are not perfect because everything's a work in progress, but basically what they're trying to do is to take that power dynamic, which is how we started out talking, and de-stress it, spread it, so that the person with the best ideas, the person with the most energy to solve the problem, the person with the best skill set to solve the problem is the one that automatically gets to step to the fore. And it's not just the one with the highest title in the meeting room.
That's good. That's good to hear because well, I'm just still looking for the end of the middle management era and when that's going to completely collapse, because everyone needs to be doing something now, not just monitoring people. And I guess that surveillance kind of standpoint really matters to that. But you hit on something as well that get me back to a good point for this point of the conversation as we move to close. And Ray, if you have anything to ask, please do, or pop it in as a question to follow up on this. Um, but we had started talking a little bit before is that you had said in the Great Reset article that there's a bunch of things that we need to do. We need to retain and hire workers. We need to help them shift to in-demand work. We need to automate, but automate to enhance, not replace, very important distinction. We need to become more inclusive. We need to stop thinking about intermittent change management and persistent and switch to persistent change management. Love all of those things. But then you had also said, we need to do this because it's the right thing to do to ensure every human has access to meaningful, well-paid work. Or if that's not enough incentive, do it because otherwise you won't like the economy we get later. And essentially it's that, it's all going to fall apart at some point. We're going to have a French Revolution or something similar to that. But we've known that, and we've known about this not being a fit for some time now. And this is an interesting opportunity. I like your way of looking at it as a window opening, not not as a window, but as the beginning. Sorry, let me get the phrasing right so I get my metaphors and analogies in play. But what is it that is going to get people to really shift? If their normal drivers has been looking for how do I increase my profit so I increase my earnings per share so I get rewarded by the market, my shareholders love me, I get my personal rewards, I get the laudatory rewards and everything else. And they've known that it's dysfunctional and that it's based on the industrial economy, but we're living in a knowledge economy. What can we do to get people to open their eyes? And have you been seeing people doing this now, realizing what might come if we don't take these actions?
So I'm going to give you a macro response, and I've written extensively on this stuff. I wrote a piece on unbundling the middle class to talk about the macro issues of the economy and some ways to think about it. And then I'm going to give you sort of the micro, like what any individual can do, right? So the macro is essentially, I talked earlier about the intersection of societies and economies. Ultimately, societies, you have to have an opinion about which should win, societies or economies, right? And it's not an either or, but societies influence the design heuristics of an economy. And the example I'll use is the economies that saw the least impact and responded and recovered the fastest from the lockdown were the Nordic countries, Germany, New Zealand, and there's a lot of very similar characteristics to their economies. They're not perfect, no economy is perfect, but their design heuristics were exactly what you were mentioning from the Great Reset piece. They wanted to keep people employed, they wanted to encourage employers to keep them employed, they wanted to continually help. It's not just a safety net, think of it as a safety hammock. That is, there's not a lot of holes in the, that a net has. It's hard for people to fall through it. They deliberately have designed the intersection of the society and the economy so that they have a safety hammock. And so we don't have that. We've got a safety net with these massive holes. We have an unemployment system. And so, so the first thing we can do if you want to monkey with the design of our peculiar form of capitalism, which is really the way this is going to change, is you want one thing? Right now, we reward capital over labor. I know that sounds like dweeby, but the truth is, if you supported your legislator to try to change the laws so that we actually don't let people make more money off of capital gains than they do off of working hard, if you have money, you're going to make a lot more money. It's just inevitable, right? And so that's just going to happen. That's a power dynamic. It's unfixable if what you're doing at the macro level is encouraging it. And it was originally done because we needed, back in the shift to the industrial era, we needed more factories and highways. Last time I looked, we got a lot of factories and highways. So we could change those, we can go back to recalibrating those, but you have to change them at the macro. What you don't want is massive laws to, basically reduce the taxes of the people with the most money and so on, because what that guarantees that capital will continue to make more than labor. So, and it doesn't trickle down. I think we've kind of put the lie to that. So at the individual level, I'm going to give you two things. The first is, as an individual. You talked about skills, you talked about self-knowledge. The best thing you can do to contribute is to continually build a better you. If you can continually have the agency to do the work you feel you have the purpose to do, if you can continually solve the problems you feel you have the purpose to do, that's taking action. That's, you know, the hope of agency is you can take an action and there's going to be potentially a positive outcome. We need to all encourage as much agency as possible. So that will change some of the, you know, the capacity of individuals to be able to build a better economy. But then on the hiring side, back to the point you were making about the design of the hiring and development process for organizations, if you have the power to hire somebody that doesn't look like you, hire somebody with a non-standard background, hire somebody that comes from a completely different life experience. Fight, you know, if the rules in your organization don't allow you to do that, fight the HR department or fight your manager or fight somebody else to champion that you will bring in that different thinker, that different doer. And you will, at least at the micro level, have made a substantial change in the way that our economy works. And if we all did that, then we've got the inclusive economy that you were talking about.
Yeah, and that is what it comes down to. It's up to each of us. And that's where I really loved Howard Rheingold's little sig line, you know, what it is up to us. And it really is here more than ever. And that's what we're hoping to do with remotely. And I know that's what you're doing with Singularity University and the students that you bring in. Ray had one question. I want to close out with this and we can get wrapped up here. Ray says, people often say that people are our best assets, but how are companies attributing a real value to the assembled quality of a team? Are there measures of a value of a team? And, you know, we're working around this new concept of team intelligence. And how are organizations valuing that team dynamic when they're really even still having trouble valuing the individual? Yeah.
So it's a great question. So I'm going to say, first off, you know, language matters. I think we've found in this year it matters a whole bunch. I think the general mentality that people are the best assets, I always am very careful about any language about people as a commodity, right? So asset, sure, and there's a lot of organizations that literally put a dollar value on that, totally understandable. What I'd like to say is instead, the mentality I try to encourage, the mindset, is people are the organization. That's it. They are the organization. And sure, there's all these other hard assets and things you can touch and that sort of thing, but people are the organization. So, and if you wanted to run your organization without any people whatsoever, sure, that's your choice. But if you have more than you, then people are the organization. So now, how do we value that? Or how do we determine the ways that, especially in the context of a team, that we can ensure that we have the best possible human energies being focused on solving the problems for the organization's stakeholders? So the answer is, first off, you don't know what you have. So better inventory, and there's tons of companies that are helping people to understand what is below the waterline in the iceberg, all the skills that you have inside the organization, all the human capacity, because that's basically what all this is about, is trying to expand human capacity and trying to help every single individual to reach their human potential. Teams need to be designed as a pool of problem solvers. That's the basic premise for the way that I approach this. That is that the quality of a team is defined by its capacity for defining and solving the problems that continue to create that value for the organization. And so that's really what many organizations are way behind on doing and need to do better. Processes for understanding themselves and helping every individual within the organization understand their own skills and capacities, and then helping teams to be able to self-assemble the superpowers, the set of superpowers that can solve the problems that need to be solved for a set of problems. Many organizations, though, they have very calcified processes by which they put people into teams, and then those teams are inside other teams inside a hierarchical structure. That's death. Like, that doesn't give you the flexibility of letting people float to find the problems that they can best solve. So these are all solvable problems. You can throw technology at the inventory process. There's a great book called The Inside Gig, Kelly Stephen Weiss, where she talks about solving that particular problem. But then putting in the process by which teams can be self-assembling to define themselves around problems and then have the alignment to continually solve them. Look at what companies like Asana are doing and what their software enables is that kind of continuous alignment. Those are some of the keys to the highway.
That's awesome. Gary, it's as always a pleasure. I've got a little brief question here for closing that should only take about another 45 minutes to answer, but we'll try to get it very quickly from you. As we're talking about this and the rigid structure of organizations and the protocols they employ to, do their thing, I just look back to thinking about obviously hierarchies for factory floor where you're producing widgets and we have to have controlled quality outputs and things like that, a lot different than a lot of the knowledge work and stuff we're doing. But when we get into these knowledge-based organizations or parts of the economy that are continuing to thrive even right now, there's a lot of different ways to look at the models. I really like what John Husband talks about relative to hierarchies and what David Gray does with the pod-based sort of teaming of it. But when I get into talking to my friends at Deloitte and elsewhere, it tends to be the talk of the matrix or the lattice even, as we've seen. Is there any of those models that the MBAs and the corporate leaders are looking at that is actually going to be meaningful to enable this great reset more than another?
So basically what is happening is we're shifting from a model of what I call the box, an organization with very hard edges, and hierarchy to manage the scarcity inside. There's only a few jobs. There's lots of people who want jobs outside. So there's abundance outside. You've got to basically build walls to manage it. Moving from a mentality of a workforce to what I call a network force. That is a range of different human talents to solve the problems of the organization. So you were right in saying that there are specific industries, and normally the heuristics for the design of these things is around risk management. There are specific industries where extremely high bar for quality means that you can innovate, but you better build a really great product. Like it better be the same high quality product over and over again. So that's a different context for how you innovate and therefore for how you help humans to be able to coordinate their work. And so what you find is there's a distribution, a landscape of work roles, and in organizations that have high quality metric needs, banks are another example, that you're going to find there's a number of work roles where the consistency of the work requires you to have more structure.
Yes.
And therefore some of the different approaches that you're talking about are useful for cross training, but you really, really need people that will deliver the quality of the product or service that's required. But there's tons of other organizations and tons of other roles that they're not anchored in that way. And so the answer is none of them is perfect, but I'll tell you the design heuristics that tend to work is the first is a really significant focus on helping every individual to understand what their best superpowers are. Like what's the intersection of what you're good at and what you love doing, because then they're going to be much more optimized and think of themselves as more optimizable in solving problems. The second is we see a lot more cross-functional training and cross-function projects. That is, however you approach that, you have the combination of sort of bid and ask. That is, here's the kinds of problems I love to solve. Here's the kind of problems we have in the organization. Oh, wait a minute, I can give you 20% of my time and I can solve that problem. Google actually used to call that 20% time. It's not as widely practiced anymore. But the basic premise is you have to unbundle a lot of that, and then you've got to give people the structure within which to do it. And then the third is a design heuristic around performance. Is what encourages performance? How do you compensate performance? There's a whole bunch of ways that, just simply being able to interact with people in other areas is itself a reward. How do you actually instantiate all of that in the way that you reward people doing the kind of innovative work that you want them to? Those are the design heuristics. And then, lattice, matrix, they're all works in progress. They're all attempts to try to come up with an approach. what I look for is organizations that are continually experimenting, and then when they find something that works, understanding why it worked and it worked in that context. So that's the, that's the kind of muscle that you look for organizations to develop.
That's fantastic, Gary. We're at time here, so I just want to get wrapped up and excuse me. Thank you so very much for sharing so much with me, giving me hope, because there are days I go back and forth between thinking it's too complex and we're not going to overcome this, to seeing that there are people like you and so many others who are actually working towards helping corporate leaders understand this and helping emerging leaders actually figure out how to practice it. And I really appreciate that so much of your advice was practical in that sense. And that's the sort of stuff we're trying to get more of, to distribute and to inspire and encourage more people to take the necessary steps and to find that courage and deploy that compassion in order to make the changes that we need. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the best thing to do for the organization. And I think that's what we're starting to see more of. And with the insurance company you mentioned earlier is one great example of that. We just need to keep collecting those stories and keep finding out why it worked and sharing why with others, and giving more people the space to continue to innovate and continue to make the world into something that we want, which is why in my closing statement, again, the world can be anything we want it to be. We just have to work to make it that. So let's continue to make that work and to make it into the world of our dreams instead of the one of our nightmares. So
Absolutely.
Thank you for contributing to so much of that, Gary. I appreciate your time today and look forward to talking to you more in the near future.
No, it's great to catch up, Chris.
Thank you, Gary.
Take care.